It's Tuesday, the 4th February 2025. Let's take a look at the headlines making waves in Nigeria today. First, the Punch newspaper. The leading story. Telecom tariff hike. NLC halts protest as federal government plans review panel. Labour leader Geregu insists committee report will determine Congress next step. You can get the complete story on page 2 of the Punch newspaper and above the leading story from the right. 200 billion naira monthly electricity subsidy benefits rich Nigerians. You can get the complete story on page 33 of the Punch newspaper. LG autonomy. NOG cautions CBN against colluding with governors. May hire auditors. You can get the complete story on page 2 of the Punch newspaper and below the leading story. Cyber terrorism. Court remands 42 Chinese, Filipinos, others $222,729 for future. You can get the complete story on page 7 of the Punch newspaper. Makinde demands diligence as Oyo gears up for Alaafin's coronation. You can get the complete story on page 18 of the Punch newspaper. Police grill Geregu Power drunk monarch. Suspended for 6 months. You can get the complete story on page 4 and 5 of the Punch newspaper. Bola Ige murder. Ladoja demands Akande's apology, threatens legal action. You can get the complete story on page 18 of the Punch newspaper. Moving over to the next paper, Vanguard, the leading story. Federal government bans export of crude set aside for local refiners. You can get the complete story on page 5 of the Vanguard and above the leading story. Federal government paying over 200 billion naira monthly as electricity subsidy, says presidential aide. You can get the complete story on page 9 of the Vanguard. You have no power to order my impeachment, Tinubu tells court. You can get the complete story on page 32 of the Vanguard. Tinubu, Sanwo-Olu, Peter Obi, Davido congratulates Thames on Grammy win. You can get the complete story on page 7 of the Vanguard. Emefiele's trial. CBN's vehicle contract followed due process, says witness. You can get the complete story on page 9 of the Vanguard. Telcos tariff hike. Labour chefs protest. Federal government sets up 10-man committee to trash issues. You can get the complete story on page 32 of the Vanguard. Edo governor pulled tribunal. PDP, Ihodalo closed case with 19 witnesses. You can get the complete story on page 14 of the Vanguard. PDP crisis. Ude Okoye's camp kicks as Anyanwu resumes office as NatSec. You can get the complete story on page 8 of the Vanguard. WCQ. Emenike gives Super Eagles 15% chance. You can get the complete story on page 37 of the Vanguard. Bola Ige's murder. Akande lied. I didn't withdraw case from court, says Ladoja. You can get the complete story on page 10 of the Vanguard. Moving over to the next paper, Nigeria Tribune, the leading story. 7 policemen short, scores wounded in Oshu Obership crisis. 4 of our youth killed. Esaoke community alleges. Adeleke orders arrest. Prosecution of perpetrators, sponsors. You can get all of this story on page 3 of the newspaper and above the leading story from the left. Bola Ige. Ladoja threatens to sue Akande. You can get the complete story on page 27 of the newspaper. PSC didn't order IG's retirement, says commission. You can get the complete story on page 4 of the Tribune. Assault. Ogun governor suspends monarch for 6 months. You can get the complete story on page 4 of the Tribune and below the leading story from the left. NAS may pass 2025 appropriation bill this week. You can get the complete story on page 4 of the newspaper. Oyo governor inaugurates 25-member coronation committee for Alaafin. Oba Owado to be crowned April 5. You can get the complete story on page 27 of the newspaper. Kogi court sacks Ohinoyi of Ibera land. You can get the complete story on page 3 of the newspaper. Ogoni land gets Federal University of Environmental Technology. You can get the complete story on page 8 of the newspaper. And below the leading story, directly under the picture, oil and gas. Nigeria earns $831.1 billion in 24 years, lost 701.48 billion barrels of crude, says Naiti. You can get the complete story on page 6 of the newspaper. FEC approves 4.2 trillion naira for major infrastructure projects across Nigeria. You can get the complete story on page 27 of the newspaper. Moving over to the next paper, Business Day, the leading story. Nigeria scrambles as Trump cuts healthcare funding. You can get the complete story on page 31 of the newspaper. Federal government response allocates 4.5 billion naira for HIV treatment. You can get the complete story also on page 31 of the newspaper and above the leading story by the right. Streaming fuels records 2.81 trillion naira internet spend. You can get the complete story also on page 31 of the newspaper. Nigerians expect naira stability to ease hardship. You can get the complete story on page 20 of the newspaper. Moving over to the next paper, Daily Trust, the leading story. National Assembly resumes today to accelerate tax reform bills. You can get the complete story on page 5 of the newspaper and above the leading story from the left. Condemnation trial as SNHIA's boss pleads not guilty. You can get the complete story on page 3 of the newspaper. Nigeria orders to get 150 billion naira euro EU fund. You can get the complete story on page 6 of the newspaper. NSC suspends protest over telcos tariff hike. You can get the complete story on page 7 of the newspaper and below the leading story. World Cancer Day. We have become burden to our families, says cancer patients. Nigeria records over 79,000 of cancer deaths annually. More treatment centers soon, says federal government. You can get all of this story on page 4 of the Daily Trust. Court sacks Ohinoyi of Ibera land. You can get the complete story on page 4 of the newspaper. Moving over to the last paper on the list today, The Guardian. The leading story. Trade war. Nigeria braces for impact as US tariffs signal fresh inflation concern. Can get the complete story on page 6 of The Guardian. And below the leading story from the left. Crude oil imports may persist amid permit revocation. Naira for crude reversal. You can get the complete story on page 3 of The Guardian. Telecom tariff hike. NLC begins strike today as key CSOs withdraw backing. You can get the complete story on page 6 of The Guardian. Electricity subsidy may hit 2.4 trillion naira this year. You can get the complete story on page 8 of The Guardian. Court sentences ex-police inspector to death for murder in Lagos. You can get the complete story on page 8 of The Guardian. FEC approves 4.8 billion naira for HIV treatment amid US aid suspension. You can get the complete story on page 3 of The Guardian. NCAA summons Kenya Airways over complaints, maltreatment rule. You can get the complete story on page 3 of The Guardian. Mother seeks justice over son's alleged assault by Abia Varsity Security. You can get the complete story on page 8 of The Guardian. SNIHS boss arraigned, remanded over alleged 90 million naira fraud. You can get the complete story on page 5 of The Guardian. And these are the headlines making waves in Nigeria today. If any of these headlines caught your attention, do get a copy of the paper to read the complete story.
Visit Housing TV Africa on YouTube and click on the subscribe button. Subscribe to Housing TV Africa to stay updated on latest happenings in Nigeria's housing sector. Follow our social media pages, like and share our posts on Facebook, Housing TV Africa, on Twitter, Housing TV Africa, Instagram, Housing TV Africa. Join the conversation and keep up with latest housing updates.
Housing TV Africa, your first in housing development broadcasting.